let me shift to the third issue, which is as problematic in the draft constitution, which is the engineering of the new political system. Based on the current draft constitution, Egypt's president continues to have the same prerogatives and authorities which Egyptian presidents did have since 1954. We continue to have not simply a presidential system, but an undemocratic presidential system where the president has vast authorities and prerogatives unchecked. No oversight, only one article on oversight with regard to the president on treason, and no clear stipulations of different checks and balances as to empower parliament and the judicial branch of government and independent oversight institutions with regard to the president. Not only that, parliamentary prerogatives and authorities are being undermined in at least one article, which is Article 196, stipulating that the budget of the military establishment and legislation pertaining to the military establishment are to be discussed in an appointed council, in the so-called National Defense Council, and then the budget to be pushed to Parliament as one figure, which means that Parliament will not be able to discuss the budget of the military establishment seriously, and it necessitates an approval of that appointed council with regard to laws and legislation pertaining to the armed forces. So the principle of civil society, principle of the civil state, oversight of elected civilians vis-à-vis military and security institutions and establishments is not guaranteed. We continue to have an undemocratic presidential system with a diminished role of parliament and with a special status of the military establishment, as if we did not go through what we did go through throughout the last 6 decades. I have to run and speed up. 2 final issues, and I'll stop 1 minute each. The fourth problematic issue in the current draft constitution pertains to the system of local government. Once again, Egypt's one of the main reasons for Egypt's failure throughout the last decades to democratize, to open up its polity, has been the centralization of the Egyptian government and the lack of incentives for decentralization. If you look at the constitution of 1971 and you compare it to the current draft constitution, it is as if not a single year passed in between. We continue to have the same centralized local government, same centralized local administration system, no incentives for decentralization, governors to be appointed by the president, budget sovereignty with the central government, no real role with regard to governorates, and so on and so forth. So one of the greatest impediments of Egypt's democratization throughout the last 6 decades, which is the centralization of the government, continues to exist. Finally, with regard to the fifth issue, and once again to prove that we are not simply preoccupied with personal freedoms and women's rights only, issues pertaining to social and economic rights in the current draft constitution, and the reference is to the 2nd chapter on rights and freedoms. Issues pertaining to social and economic rights are not addressed in a way which corresponds to the popular demand on social justice in Egypt. Social and economic rights, education, healthcare, social safety networks, and so on and so forth are not safeguarded in a way which would be conducive to a liberal market economy, socially responsible. They are addressed in a way which eats away from what Egyptians did have in the last 6 decades in an unprecedented manner. Those are five big issues in the draft constitution, and as a result, liberal forces outside of the Constituent Assembly continue their struggle for newly forming the assembly and for a better constitution, which Egypt does deserve after its democratic revolution. And liberal forces inside the assembly have threatened, as of today, in fact, that they are going to withdraw unless different adjustments are going to take place in the current draft constitution addressing the 5 issues which I outlined, and unless the Constituent Assembly is extended time-wise in its work with 3 additional months to avoid, as we say in Egypt, to avoid prematurely getting done with the constitution without real discussion and without offering Egyptians the constitution which they deserve after a democratic revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, our next speaker, Dr. Nathan Brown, will round out the discussion on the Constitution and give us a broader perspective on how this process is going among other institutions in Egyptian society, the military, the judiciary, and others. Dr. Nathan Brown is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University here in Washington and a recipient of Fulbright grants to study in Egypt and the Gulf and teach in Israel. He's also a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the author of When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics, and Palestinian Politics After the Oslo Accords, Resuming Arab Palestine, among other publications. Dr. Brown received his BA in political science from the University of Chicago and his master's and PhD in politics and Near East Studies from Princeton University. His dissertation received the Malcolm Keir Award from the Middle East Studies Association in 1987. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brown.
Thank you very much. I'm actually not going to start with Egypt and the constitutional process, and the reason is that this panel is a special treat for me. I come immediately after Amr Hamzawy, who is a very dear friend, a former co-author, a colleague, and also actually a former neighbor of mine, because he lived in Vienna, Virginia, not far from where I live. And he's been so busy lately, the only time I see him now is on panels. So the only time that, I want to tell him how my kids are doing, find out how his are. But what I will do instead of going through all that is just bring him a little bit of disturbing news from your old home in Vienna. So, an incident that happened a couple months ago, and I'm just reading from the police report. A town employee reported at 10:28 a.m. on August 28th there was a snowman hanging from a tree with fake blood on it in the 300 block of Glendon Street Northeast. The snowman was stuffed with beer cans where his lights were supposed to be. Now, you listen to this and all kinds of questions. 5 questions. Snowman, tree, August, beer, blood. Some mysteries will never be explained. But the town of Vienna police do not bother even to try to answer those questions. Instead, they hurry to reassure you, and I'm reading from the police report, the town employee was able to free the snowman and took him to a place where he would be cared for properly. And I thought that I would actually use that as a metaphor for what I'm going to do in talking about Egypt today. Some things are simply too complicated to understand. There's a political process which would take hours to explain, and even then I'm not sure we would understand it. The real question is the snowman being cared for properly? And a little bit of strain given the Egyptian climate to liken this Egyptian society to the snowman, but that's the approach that I want to take. Is something, when you focus on day-to-day, you see an awful lot of confusion. Is this a political process that is fundamentally going to deliver a sounder political system that will meet the needs of the Egyptian people? And the answer, I think, is basically, yeah, kind of, I think so, but there's some problems. And what I want to do is focus first on the political process as a whole, and then specifically on the constitutional process, pick up some of the issues that Amr raised, and talk about what's going right and what's going wrong. Political process, I mean, again, clear big picture, what is going right that when we step back and, like the town of Vienna police, concentrate only on making, sort of on the big picture and whether things are being properly cared for. You have a meaningful political process. You've had elections in which outcomes were not known in advance. And you have the slow civilianization of political authority in Egypt in a way that the country hasn't seen. You have, for the first time, a president of the republic who comes not from the military, but essentially from the civil society. And those are things that I think are fundamentally healthy. And you have a real political process underway in which genuine political issues are being debated. The level of sophistication of some of the discussions about the Constitution are ones that are actually, I think, fairly impressive. And we've heard some of those things from Amr. But there are 2 big issues, I think, that do give me some concern about the political process as a whole, that 2 areas of concern. Number 1 is just the degree of polarization within Egyptian politics today. And again, let me go back to Virginia, where I live right now. And anybody who is in this room who lives in Virginia knows what it's like to live in a swing state shortly before a presidential election. And you are absolutely harangued by anonymous calls that get increasingly shrill as the election gets closer. And nothing would prepare you better for the state of Egyptian political discourse today than the kind of really nasty negative campaigning that takes place right before a presidential election here. The missing element, however, right now is you have a political structure in which those various forces don't really know how to talk to each other, and they have no place to talk to each other. The dissolution of Parliament that took place earlier this year was one that was fundamentally, I think, unhealthy for that process. Regardless of your opinion of what the Parliament was up to, there was at least a place where various political forces had to come and deal with each other in order to get things done. And that's no longer the case. You've got basically one real elected structure right now in Egyptian politics, and that's the presidency. And that leads me to the second thing, is that the approach of the presidency specifically and the Brotherhood generally, I think, is that yes, they realize that there are other political forces in the country that they have to come to terms with, but the ones that they are most concerned about are the ones inside the Egyptian state. And they seem to do a much better job bargaining with the military and bargaining with the judiciary than they do with other political forces. From their behavior, it seems that their biggest concern for other political forces, as I say, are state structures, or to the extent that they look to the society, they're concerned about the Salafi movements. We'll hear more about the Salafi movements from Jack Brown. From Georgetown, I hope, but there's no real effective process, I think, by which the what the groups that call themselves now the civil political forces really have of a sustained and meaningful dialogue with those in authority. Let me turn now specifically to the constitutional process. And here I would give a slightly rosier version than the one we just heard from Amr, but it is still one with significant problems. What is going right? Well, I think that on the religious provisions of the Egyptian constitution, when you keep in mind the fact that Egyptian elections return a strong showing for religious parties, that the sort of compromise language that is coming out of the Constitutional Assembly, it's certainly not the constitution that I would write for my country, but it is not an unreasonable compromise given the array of forces in Egyptian political life today. And there's also the possibility, I think, for a consensus outcome on many different issues that appear at first to be divisive. Now, you won't know that if you follow the debate day to day, and there's a reason for that, I think, and that is that the Islamists simply dominate the assembly. And that means any time things come to a vote, they win. And that's the way the rules are written. If ultimately it comes to a vote, the Islamists win. The non-Islamists in that assembly have only one tool. They can't win any vote, but they can threaten to walk out and essentially present with the result that the document would be presented to the Egyptian people not as a consensus outcome, but as one that is essentially over the dead bodies of the civil political forces. That's a potent threat to use, and but it's the only one that they have to use, and so they use it repeatedly and over. So you have this extremely noisy political debate. Ultimately, as I say, I think a negotiated solution is possible. And one of the reasons has to do with the basic interest of what is the most dominant force in that assembly, and that's from the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood. Because they realize, I think, that any constitution that comes out of this assembly is likely to set in motion a political process in which they'll do fine, thank you. So any document that comes out of that assembly is essentially fine with them. That's not true for everybody, and certainly not true for the Salafis, but I think that is true for the Brotherhood. So Sam al-Aryan, who's a major Brotherhood figure, a Freedom and Justice Party figure, said just yesterday, he was talking about dropping the provision in the Egyptian constitution that would mandate zakah or alms payments. And he basically said, it was an interesting comment, he said, look, there's pilgrimage, there's fasting, there's Ramadan, those things aren't mentioned in the constitution. Why do you have to mention this in the constitution? This already exists in Egypt. You don't need to put it in the document. The Brotherhood realizes that it doesn't matter so much an awful lot of what these say. Article 68, which Amr talked about, is one that in the latest authoritative draft exists as he said, but there are indications now that the Brotherhood will simply say, okay, fine, we'll just drop that article. It makes everybody upset, so let's just drop the entire thing. And again, that's a process by which they can essentially come to agreements with other political forces. It's going to be very difficult for them to come to an agreement simultaneously with the Salafis and with the civil political forces in the same assembly. But given clever drafters, I'm not sure that that some kind of consensus outcome is impossible.